of all, I want to say welcome to everybody to the event Has the Giant Awoken? Understanding the Mass Protest Movement in Brazil. I first want to begin by thanking Bet Zaytoun and Robert for, of course, being the gracious hosts that they are and have always been for the type of community events we like to see happening in our city. Also want to thank our endorsers, the Greater Toronto Workers Assembly, Toronto New Socialists, Center for Social Justice, Socialist Project, Socialist Action, Oakford York, and I believe that's all of them off the top of my head. And of course, all of you for being here today for what should be a very interesting and engaging discussion. Just to say a few words about some background about the events that are currently ongoing in Brazil. The protest movement first started out in opposition to a 10 or 20 cent fare hike in public transportation, which was really galvanized by the Movimento Passa Livre, or Free Fare movement, and from there really erupted into what we're seeing is really the largest scale of social mobilizations that have taken place in the country, really arguably since the military dictatorship in the country that ended in 1985, or if not that, at least since the early 90s against the presidency of Fernando Collor. We've seen over 1 million people take to the streets at its peak in over 100 Brazilian cities, and not only over the fare hike, which was the original impetus for the protest, but also a whole range of grievances. So to find out more about who these protests are, why they've taken to the streets, and what are those grievances, we're joined here by 3 speakers. We originally were supposed to have 2 by Skype, but unfortunately one of the speakers wasn't able to make it. So we're happy to at least have one of them here on board. And our 3 speakers here are Mariana, Faraz, Duarte, Rubem Silva, and Samia, Bomfim. So without further ado, I'll toss it over to Rubem Silva. I don't see the bio, but he is a member of Juntos, which was one of the leading social movements behind the protests ongoing in Brazil. And right now he is on transfer doing an exchange at the University of Toronto in public health studies.
So, hi everyone, it's a pleasure for me to stay here and talk with you. I think I have a little bit problem with English, so you probably have some difficulties understanding me in some points and also with my accent. But I have prepared some writings here, so I'm gonna read some things. But I'm gonna do like a kind of introduction to what we are gonna discuss tonight. And it's taking more general and political context of what's going on in Brazil. And then I think Mariana and Samia will discuss further the very specific problems related to the strikes, the manifestations in Brazil. And I'm going to take more a political scenario and more a political discussion and context. So why we are here today or tonight? This event has an important task that is discuss the political moment in Brazil, bringing the experience of Brazilian activists to understand the political struggles that have taken place in many cities in Brazil. More than take standing on this political moment, being the side of the Dilma's government or even in the opposition, which means a variety of positions from conservative to liberals and democratic to radical left-wing sides. We first should understand the specificity of this moment in a large scale as a factor that has been changing our ways of thinking, popular participation, the people's whole role into the political arena, and particularly to understand people's demands embedded in social and political contradictions that Brazil lives right now. I'm going to do a brief introduction of what our comrades will talk over next hour, so that you can have an overview of major problems that we're touching. In addition, some of these points are also analytical elements of our current context. And as a Brazilian tradition in social movements, we can't discuss and understand any political moment without paying attention to our political conjuncture, the political context, the social actors involved with, and more importantly, the political interests in our political system. Brazil is witnessing the largest mass protests to hit the country in over 20 years. Initiated by the Free Fare movement in PL in Sao Paulo, against a planned 20 cents public transit fare hike, the protest quickly spread toward other major cities across the country. As it took over 1 million people in over 100 Brazilian cities took to the streets to protest a wide range of grievances, from denial of LGBT rights, massive political corruption, to wasteful World Cup spending. Small towns in the countryside have also held protests regarding local issues. Both Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro was the epicenter of protests of thousands that didn't stop asking mayors and governors the solutions of such many social problems. It reveals at first an increasingly political awareness that takes place in Brazil. As well, intrinsic issues in our histories like corruption, democratic participation, high salaries of deputies, and the oppressive institutions that is the military police have been raised as signals of low satisfaction with the current system and governments. The expression "the Giant has awoken" goes in certain ways to the people's awareness of so much structural repression and inequalities in our society. This rebellion is a result of accumulated dissatisfaction, exploitation, and sufferings that people cope on a daily basis that give meaning and size to the manifestations that we are seeing in Brazil, in many states, and in many cities. To see like just an example of a kind of insatisfaction that people have in Brazil, to illustrate this, one of the major points that protesters in Brazil demand is for the removal of Feliciano, is a declared homophobic, racist deputy who is the president of the Human Rights Council of the Brazilian Parliament. He's part of the correct political base of the Works Party of the President Dilma Rousseff and has the endorsement of conservative and evangelical fundamentalists. This example reveals the limits of PT, a government and party with a very conservative political base that cannot guarantee some policies because they have to deal with what we have of more moralist and conservative representation in our country. These manifestations were bigger than that protests in the early 90s related to the President Collor's impeachment, and it reminds the explosion of the 60s against the dictatorship period in Brazil. The crude point is would you imagine that a generation portrayed as depoliticized would come over and take the leadership of such important process? In fact, our parents of my generation, at least I'm 23, still live with the idea of a considered ideal generation that struggled against the dictatorship period, who was taking my own example. My family don't think that our current generation would be capable to do something to change Brazil, because they think that the ideal generation was in the past during the dictatorship period when people fight against the military command in Brazil. So today we have a new generation in the street and we are saying something different. Still today my generation wasn't incapable to be part of the political scenario to the eyes of many, I'd say, reactionary people. Rather, the same generation which has been leading the streets in Brazil is exactly the same which has constructed fights against capitalism, this neoliberal system, and our social contradictions and inequalities for years. There are the expressions of awakening mainly refers to the major people who are experiencing protests for the first time and have encountered in this political moment a way to verbalize their problems, which also is good and revolutionary at this time. In addition, what's happening in Brazil is not something isolated from the world. In fact, we cannot understand this reality without paying attention to what is going on in Europe, especially in Spain, Portugal, Greece, Tunisia, and in the revolutionary process in Arabic countries. I remember when the protests started in Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon a couple of years ago. In that moment, I was temporarily living in Scotland, and I met some people from those countries. One of them told me that the main protests were spontaneously being organized by Facebook and Twitter. Moreover, I read much news that the women were in the front controlling and leading the process with equal power to men in that countries. In that moment, I realized that this young generation has more to teach the old politics than we could realize before. In the following year, the Facebook has already overspread in Brazil, and some manifestations such as o churrasco da gente diferenciada, which was a protest against the elite who wouldn't like to have a subway line close to a high expensive neighborhood because they didn't like a lot of people, so we don't want this line beside of our neighborhood. This was the first example, the very first example of the importance of social medias in the current political protests in Brazil. The Brazilian media and the mainstream thinking ignored the fact that this was a new way of organizing people through their interests. In the following years, we had public demonstrations for the legalization of marijuana and other drugs. We had against the militarization of the police, march of LGBT rights, and etc. That assumed a collective mode of organization, horizontality without hierarchy, power-based. This was the new way of doing politics by this generation, and we should support them and understand them from this perspective. Not only the methods, but the content of the protests are similar as well. The conditions of unemployment and marginalizations of young people in Spain, and the complete collapse of Greece's economy by the contradictions of capitalism reveals to us how this system doesn't work anymore if you consider social equality between people, an ecological society free of racism, homophobia, and so forth. These manifestations don't have only claims of reducing fares and taxes. Rather, behind these, there is a general assumption that this system doesn't match our real necessities for life. The necessity of free transportation, for example, good education, human rights, adequate health care, and claims for a real democratic political system without corruption, scandals, and so on, confront the structure of the capitalism system, which is something very new for us, because you haven't had a lot of protests and manifestations since 20 years ago, and now we are discussing problems, structural problems in Brazil, which is fantastic. Furthermore, the logic of neoliberalism, this is the precursor of such exploitation of works by giving privilege to the bourgeoisie, who's the only 1% of the Brazilians. And that, the idiom that we are 99% against 1% comes from Los Indignados from Spain, which then became part of the worldwide Occupy movement. Although the Occupy movement in Brazil was incomparable in size to what North America had, the manifestations we are seeing in Brazil are a kind of version, much more developed, of what was Occupy Street in Brazil. The fights are clearer, and the confrontation with the government gained national and international repercussion. The political moment that the international economic crisis opened in the world has gained new chapters year to year, which reinforce the idea that this political moment will persist for longer and will be in a constant dispute. Also, we cannot understand the reason of these protests without paying attention to the contradictions of Lula and Dilma government. The first term of Lula's government was a sort of hope to the people that during the 80s and 90s constructed political alternative in Brazil. However, PT assumed a role of continuation of a liberal economic system year to year, being more distant of social movements, doing alliances with conservative parties such as PP, PSC, PDT, PMDB, PSL, PSD, and so forth, and also assuming the interest of the private sector in major national policies. Of course, we had much improvement as well, especially to low-income people with income distribution, access to education, and better health indicators. And also a lot of things, especially in the secondary school, so people had more access to universities and social indicators get better. The idea of we are a superpotence was coined in the context of a worldwide economic crisis, which is relatively tricky. Also, we are comparing the reality in Brazil with Europe, where the neoliberal system has already affected millions of people in different ways and time. The contradictions people are facing in Brazil are the proof that we are so far to become a real potence. I have to say that as a result of such a way that PT and its political base in Brazil has been going, reflects on the way that this generation sees politics. The majority of people are skeptical of political parties because they don't rely that such a structure would change the system, which is completely understandable in our reality. PT is an example of this, a party which was a symbol of change that today assumes a role of perpetuating contradictions and discontentment of the people. Of course, not all parties have followed the same route. The considered left parties such as PSOL, PCB, and PSTU support the manifestations and the youth collective organizations in Brazil also. To conclude, all of these macro-level political elements influence the life in the city, the urban life, the life of the people. It affects who is going to pay more to have access to transportation, and this also explains the political interest of our governments, which is often to help the private sector with much more profits, particularly in the cases of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. The political decisions of our governments have taken the attention of this young generation, and they are presenting new methods and new principles of doing politics. It might be the reason that some deputies and senators said they don't understand what's going on in the street because they don't understand the movements. Because the way we are doing politics in Brazil is different the way they did in the past. So my final word is just to say I think the new times are coming, and I think we have a lot of things to discuss about our perspectives about what's going on in Brazil and the contradictions within the government and also with social movements. So I think I leave this part to my friends to develop these ideas. Thank you.
Right now we will hear from Mariana. Mariana is a community development and health researcher concerned with social justice and participatory decision making. Her experience combines popular education, community organizing, and facilitation using a Freirean approach.
First of all, thank you for coming. Thank you, Robert and Bezitun, for giving voice to us to talk about and reflect, examine the protests in Brazil. Thank you, Ali, for the invite. I know Ali since 2008. My English that time was very broken, and so he knows, like my progress speaking English. So if you guys don't understand, something, you can even stop and ask me. Okay, I'm going to try to my best here. Particularly to talk about something that I'm very passionate about, that is social justice and urban equalities. Because when you think about the protests, you have to keep in mind what happened that we, like, how, you know, those people invoke minds and hearts to go to the street. What those people have in common, you know, and they are there protesting and all these demonstrators and the young middle class, and now we also can see that residents from favelas also are going to the streets, so we can see that in organizing marches. And so what is that? And for me, my reflection is that we have a urban crisis in Brazil, and that is the protests they reflect the urban crisis in Brazil. So to think about this, you know, like the protests, it's think about the whole of the city. It's to think about the whole of the city in the process of the development of capitalism, and also think about like the social and the political economic forces of capitalism and how they operate, they intersect, and they produce inequalities, you know, in our cities. So, and that's what I'm going to like briefly talk about, you know, those political economic forces. And this is another thing that's very interesting, because we have those forces on a macro level, but they also impact and affect the lives of people in the micro level, now in the cities. So it's very important to us to reflect about that. And this is something that when you are talking, we work with popular education, and we try to, you know, like people like understand and reflect about the reality. It's also very good to share the context, and that's why I'm gonna do here, talk about the urban crisis in particularly in large cities in Brazil, right? So, first of all, we know that the city. Okay.
Keep it in your mouth.
Keep it horizontal.
All right, I see. Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Alô, alô. Here is better, huh? Okay, so you know, like cities throughout the development of capitalism, they played an important role, you know, in the process. You know, like the built environments, they are parts of a complex network of industries, harbors, schools, hospitals, offices, stores, that they contribute to the circulation, production, circulation, and the exchange and consumption of commodities. But we, like some critical urbanists have been noted and highlighted that the city also became a great business, right? So the cities also became themselves commodified. So you see the cities, the infrastructure, and particularly in large cities like those that I'm talking about, Sao Paulo, Rio, Belo Horizonte, Salvador, they have become very, very, they are overpopulated. So we have a problem with the land use. We have a problem that the land became a commodity, right? And in Brazil also, the state has been much more responsible, just historically, you know, it's not since PT, but I mean, like historically, the state has been much more responsive to capitalist ruling class than to popular class, and which means that urban policies and planning, like land using, zoning, urban renewal projects, they have been favoring developers, multinational corporations, and property owners to the detriment of the people, right? So as a result, we see that the urban benefits, they have been unevenly distributed within the cities, benefiting some groups to the detriment of others, some neighborhoods at the expense of others, and contributed to the growing of pockets of wealth and poverty, characterized by a spatial segregation and unequal distribution of essential resources like employment, adequate housing, health food, health care, public transportation, parks, and public space. So, because, as I mentioned, the Brazilian large cities have become very overpopulated. We have a lot of urban issues, and associated with this capitalist model of development and of urbanization, this capitalist urbanization process in the cities, we have a lot of urban issues, a lot of problems. No? So, example, when I say that the Brazilian state favoring the capitalist ruling class, I'm saying that the state in large big cities, instead of investing in public transportation, they have been investing massively in private transportation, promote the sale of cars and construction of highways outside the cities. So as a consequence, car owners are getting stuck in rush hours inside the cities, and people who depend on public transportation have the worst service. I don't have pictures here to show, but it's terrible. You know, I say this is the real urban vandalism. This is a vandalism, you know, like when people have to wait like 2-3 hours to get home, or they are in a subway a station that's crowded, you know, like and people, they can get home. So that's why people also get so pissed off with the fare hike, you know, like it's not that only 20,000 cents. It's much more than that. So we have to pay for a service that's not good, and our cities don't provide to us a good quality of life. So, as I mentioned before, with the overpopulation of Brazilian large cities, the urban land has become like a profitable commodity, and we have been assisting the freezing of housings and rental prices, putting heavy restriction on access to these areas for less privileged part of population. So we can see the same, you know, like phenomenon here in Toronto and everywhere, right? But the situation is particularly difficult because in Brazil, because people don't have place to live in the center, in the inner cities, so they go to the very peripheral areas that are close to rivers and close to hills and in a very dangerous places, and that people don't supposed to live there. Even if those areas are illegal to live, okay? So it's very difficult because people feel very vulnerable because they live in those areas that they don't supposed to live. And for the state, it's very convenient because they are there, they can be there. You know, it's a legal area, and you stay there, so we don't need to invest in infrastructure, and we can remove you guys. Because we don't supposed to be there. So it's a very difficult situation. My argument is that the state legitimizes the continuing dominance of certain classes and intergroups in decision-making process related to the urban planning and urban design, like urban renewal projects and any land use zonings that favor developers and the owners of properties. So what happens is that this process promotes, like the state, by investing in those areas, promotes the gentrification of those areas and the dispossession and displacement of local population to those neglected and high-density suburban space with poor infrastructure. Okay, so even some people that's more familiar with Brazil or even with urbanism, they can think about the urban planning and the participatory urban planning that we have in Brazil and the Estatuto of Cidade, of the cities. Then we have a very powerful and strong laws that provide the right to the seat for the citizens, right? But what we see is that those processes, you can facilitate a process of urban planning, but the next election, they change the government. So all the process that we have, that we work with participatory, like engagement, the popular, like education, everything that you discuss, if you have like a conservative government. In the next election, forget it. You know, so it's very also frustrating for people who work with participatory planning and also for communities and grassroots who are involved in this process, because we learn to think about the city, you learn to plan, but you know, like the next election, you know, the dream is over. So this is something that is very common in Brazil, and again, we have a lot of politicians that they represent the capitalist ruling class. So all this process, you know, like our participatory urban planning and everything, we have to send to politicians, I don't know, say in English, for the councillors, like vereadores. They are going to approve, you know, like they're going to decide, you know, so they are going to invest in infrastructure or even a plaza that the community. But again, they are much more interested in big investments and big, how can I say, constructions and infrastructure. So it's also very frustrating for us, you know, like for popular educators and grassroots and social housing movements that are working with participatory planning. Okay, so when you were talking, and this is another thing that I think that's very important to highlight. I don't know if you guys, you read our discussion on Facebook. Some people posted some discussion about the question like class and even the discussion about race and why you don't consider in some Marxist urbanists, they don't consider the class. And I just want to say that in our case, it's people used to say that in Brazil you are like a racial democracy, and in fact we have like our social tension, it's bigger, but you have to think, okay, the social tension, like rich and poor, it's great, it's bigger, we have this, but who are in the low classes and the popular classes in Brazil, right? So we have like predominant, like a black population, not the predominant, but it's most of them are black. So you also can see that when you're talking about the spatial segregation, now you can see that there is clearly a spatial kind of segregation against the black communities along the periphery of large cities. So the space that have the infrastructure, like basic sanitation, garbage collection, and proximity to other services such as healthcare and schools, are visibly occupied by people of white or European background, whereas the periphery without basic infrastructure is predominantly black. Regarding quality of life, you can see that 73% of the black population live in rustic dwellings or huts or houses of adobe, straw or wood in favelas, against 25% of the white population. So much of the black population does not enjoy basic service like water and indoor plumbing, garbage collection and sanitation, which would certainly result in a better standard of health. And about 61% of the black population live in high density areas, and 71% of blacks share accommodations with other families who have no private bathroom, and while 28% of whites living in this situation. So the number of blacks living in these precarious conditions is more than double of whites. And finally, like regional differences end up creating barriers to minimum standard of living and access, such as access to information and comfort in the home. So about 71% of blacks do not enjoy electricity against 28% of whites, as shown by the data released by IPEA, Institute of Economic Research in 2002. We just finished, yeah. So The mega events like the World Cup, the Olympics Games, they have like further accentuated dispossession and displacement of those living in the favelas, located particularly in the proximity of the stadiums. So even like the favelas residents, housing movements, NGOs, and human rights organizations, they have also denounced the repressive, coercive mechanism adopted by the state to protect the interests of FIFA, the multinational corporations and developers who are in charge of the events. For example, like in Rio de Janeiro, we have a program called Pacification of Favelas, who has been showed by the traditional media. We're going to talk about them later. As a community policing, which is in reality it's a sizing of territory by militarized police with curfew, invasion of homes without a warrant, and the prohibition of everything. And it's something very similar with that happens in Palestine. By the way, the same police is trained by Israel. So, and they say that some scholars, people who study this militarization, they say that the topography, the landscape of Gaza, it's very similar with the topography and the landscape of favelas. So, so they have been trained there, and of course, it's a militarized police. So they are not there to serve the community, but they are there to see people as their enemies, right? So it's a very hierarchical police, so that's why, and they suffer the hierarchical, like among them, so we have the general, we have, like those, so who are, like on the bottom, after, like, below the police, who? Before it was people from favelas, right? Like majority of black people, as we saw here, but now they have the vandals, they have the students, they have the young middle class. So that's why we also say that now the youth, the middle class has also experienced the same violence applied to people living in favelas, right? So this is another thing that we can talk before. And now we're gonna talk to Samia, and she's gonna give us like a context and explain what's going on in the protests and everything. It's good to have someone there. And so that's it. That's my contribution.
Can you hear me, guys? Yeah? Okay, so my name is Samia. I'm part of Juntos movement in Brazil. We are organization of young people, generally from universities and schools here in Brazil, and we fight for our rights, yeah. But for us in Brazil, it is very far from our possibility or our reality to claim for any kind of right or any kind of restraint with the government. But here we don't have a political culture of people in the streets protesting for their rights. There's a long time we don't see a mass movement here in Brazil. We can consider that the political here in Brazil is made of
Samia,
okay.
desculpa, você pode falar mais perto do computador e falar um pouco mais devagar?
Isso. Yeah.
Ok.
Porque aqui o som ele tá um pouquinho ruído, então a gente não consegue te ouvir.
Não, então tem, eu ouvi vocês bem mal também, bem falhados.
Entendi. Mas tenta falar próximo do computador e aí fala um pouco mais devagar. E aí a gente consegue te ouvir melhor.
Tá melhor aqui? Tá melhor?
Tá melhor assim.
Tá, eu vou começar de novo então, melhor?
Isso.
Tá bem.
She's gonna start it again just to... Okay? Which is...
But you can hear me better now?
It'd be great if you speak slow.
Okay, I'll try to speak. So hello, I'm Samia. I'm from Juntos Movement. Our movement was free to fight for our rights here in Brazil. Yeah, okay. And I'll try to speak a little bit about what happens in Brazil. Yeah, first of all, I'm sorry if I'm bad English. There's a long time I don't speak English, so yeah, I'll try to speak the best way I can. Yeah. So here in Brazil, we don't have the political culture of people on the street fighting for the rights. Yeah, there's a long time we don't see a mass movement. There's a long time we don't see people conquering something like any kind of right or any kind of change in the politics. And this movement in June here in Brazil was very important because we saw for the first time in my generation people on the street fighting for their rights and making, like, stopping the street, stopping the principal street of my city, which is Sao Paulo, which is Avenida Paulista, and we started to see different kinds of people going to the street to fight for their rights, because here the social movements are made for with an avant-garde, like generally the young people, the students, or I don't know, the political movements, yeah, but you don't see the majority of people in the streets fighting for the rights. So it was very important mainly because of this reason. And the politics in Brazil, we can consider that it's made like the same people and the same families which from decades are congressmen, and we can see that there are a lot of corruption. So, but in the same time, there was an appearance that Brazilian people didn't claim for the right, weren't annoyed with the situation, yeah? So, but it started to change with this movement in June. It started with the Movimento Passe Livre, which is an organization against transportation tax, convoke protests against the tax increasing every time it happened. And this year it wasn't different. Like the first protest had about 5,000 people, yeah, and they convoked another protest. It increased a little bit each, but it was mainly composed of the same avatars, yeah, the young people, the students, and like the socialist parties of here in Brazil. But there was one protest, I forgot the date, but there was one protest, yeah, that was very violent, like the repression of the government and of the police against the movement was very strong, and the people started to see the movement with different eyes, because in the beginning people considered us like vandals, people who don't know what are they doing on the streets, like, because of this culture, you know, we don't have the culture of people on the streets, so we are the vandals, because there are some people who also break the streets, break the banks, and also, I don't know, the government places. So, but it started to change, yeah, because of the huge repression of the police. So the movement increased, and more people started to go to the streets. Like you could see families on the streets. We could see more than only the same youth. Yeah, we could see different people which started to consider the streets the place to fight for their rights. And then there was a day which in all the capitals and the principal cities of Brazil, there were protests claiming for the decrease of the tax, the transportation taxes. And the taxes started to decrease. Yeah, the government announced in a lot of cities of Brazil the decrease of these taxes. So it was very good, it was very important because it was the first conference we had in our generation. And after that, the movement didn't stop. Like we changed what we are fighting for, but the movement didn't stop. Because more people started to go to the streets, maybe we didn't have a clear, how can I say? It wasn't clear what the people were fighting for. In my point of view, it was the people showing that they don't agree with the political system in Brazil, they don't agree with the corruption, and they started to show that they wanted change in Brazil, in the system, in the political system in Brazil, yeah. So, but you can see that it was self-organized. There wasn't a direction. People was starting to deny the parties. Also, the socialist parties, like you could see that there was one day that people fighted with organizations, yeah, and socialist parties in Brazil because it's the characteristics of this movement also, like. People don't have a leader, people don't have a party, people don't have a clear debate, a clear political debate. Yeah, people are on the streets because they want change. And the government had to give something that people are claiming for. I think there are some points that show this movement was very important. The first of all, because it showed that the government scheme is not accepted by people. Yeah, like we considered people in Brazil are very passive, and it started to change. Yeah, with this movement in June. And why the movement was very important for us. Yeah. First of all, because it has shown that the government scheme is not well accepted in Brazil. Like, we hear just that people are passive, we judge that people have no political participation, and really don't matter about it. Like, but it started to change with this movement in June. Like, people started to recognize the streets as the place of fighting for the rights, as a place of there's a possibility of conquering, struggling and achieving what they claim, questioning the government. I think the second point of this movement is like the party, the corruption, the political system has suffered its first cliff, which obligated the government to accept some of the movement claims, like it reduced the transport price, there's a project which was called S37, which was about the corruption in Brazil, and it stopped to apply the project. The Congress started to apply this project, and also the cura gay. I think Rubem has already told about it. It was like a psychological treatment for gay people. Yeah, we could stop this project of congressman, which is called Marco Feliciano, and we say he's going to be the next comfort that the movement will have, because we want. Because he's the chief of, here we call the direitos humanos.
Human rights.
Yeah, like the human rights, the minority and the human rights. And he's the chief of this how can I say, secretary of the government, yeah. So we don't want that he stays there anymore, and we think it's gonna be possible because the movement started to see the minority reclaimed as part of this obligation, yeah, in the center of the movement now. I guess an important point of this movement, it was because it happened in the same time as the Confederation Cup, you know, like the media had to show more what was happening on the street than what was happening on the stadium. Like it had the main news and journals of Brazil had to talk about it. The newspapers had to change what they're talking about to treat the movement on the street as something which was good, and had to treat the protesters, which in the beginning was vandals, as people who had the right to be on the street, claiming for their rights. So it was very important because it changed the idea of social movement, changed the idea of people claiming for the rights, and I think that the government will have to accept more this kind of movement in Brazil, and also give what people are claiming on the streets, yeah. Rubem told me to talk a little bit about some things that the government has done after we started to go to the streets, because Dilma, how can I say, Dilma, in the beginning of the year, was considered the name for the next election. Like her re-election was very secure. Yeah, we didn't. How can I say? We didn't see PT and Dilma government as something which people here in Brazil questioned and people didn't like, but it started to change. And also the government is not anymore very secure as it was before. So maybe the parties in Brazil will have to change their politics. They'll have to accept that there's a new way of making politics in Brazil, yeah? And prepare some plans and projects that have to do with what people are claiming on the street. So there's a project which talks about corruption and a very, I don't know how to say. Yeah, like corruption as a horrible crime, yeah, something like this. I don't know the right name in English. And people expect this kind of plan now. So the Congress will have to act in a different way, because people don't accept anymore the congressmen as their leaders, or even the same government as the people who are going to increase the people's quality of life. Because here in Brazil we have the idea that the people's life has become better because of the government Dilma and government Lula, yeah, the PT government. But we can see that how can I say, the consumption power of people has increased, but the access to healthy and education services of the government is almost the same. Like people didn't have benefits in the social rights. Yeah, it continues the same. So I think this is the main point that shows the contradictions of this government, yeah, because people don't see their lives are better, and the people started to suffer with inflation here in Brazil in this period. And there's the idea that there's no money for investing on the rights, but at the same time, people thought there was money to invest on the stadium construction, to the constructions for the World Cup, and even there's money for the corruption. So it started to have, in my opinion, political scenario here in Brasilia. I don't know if there's something more that I can tell about what's happening. I don't know if you have any specific question about what's going on.
Yes, Samia, could you talk a little bit more what's going on today in Brazil? Because there is a very big strike in Brazil. It's a national strike, right? So we don't know a lot of things about these and how people are being organized in many states, or what they are discussing today. What's the main points they are doing, especially in Sao Paulo, because there are a lot of unions in Sao Paulo, and people, I think, they are in the street doing some protests tonight and today. So do you have some news or updates of what's going on today in Brazil? 2 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Labor union. Okay. The movement today. Was involved by the main labor union or syndicate, the trade union, I don't know the word you say there, of Brazil. And there were paralyzations and the laborers on the streets, not all the states of Brazil. Yeah, there were some states that more people stopped their jobs, and like in Rio Grande do Sul. Yeah, but there are some other states which the paralyzation was low. Few laborers paralyzed their jobs because the syndicates are very controlled by the government. Yeah, so it wasn't what we could expect of a labor movement. You see, but. In our opinion, it's a very important day because it was the first day of a huge paralyzation like this. There are lots of years that we don't see the laborers organized in their syndicates, stopping their jobs to play for their rights. You see, the last time was in 1998. So it's very it's the first. It's the first strike in the PT government, yeah. So it's very important because PT in the past was the party which organized the social movement, and nowadays it's a party which is against the social movement. Yeah, the social movement is asking the politics of the government. So I think it's very important for the new socialist party. It's very important for the new syndicates which are trying to reorganize the movement here in Brazil. I don't know if it's enough.
Yeah.
Okay.